The cliffs of Amethyst Mountain are one of the really cool features of the area and the game map, but they've also been trouble from the very beginning. And I've done a couple videos already about carving them and trying to get them to look good, but they are tough. The conglomerate and a bunch of other kinds of rocks here are very crumbly, and so a lot of the techniques that you normally use to create a nicely eroded cliff structure don't work so well here. And I've been struggling with it for the past 2 years, and finally what ended up in the game upon release in July was really not what I was aiming for originally, and it was a bit of a desperation move to get something that looked decent. But it caused all sorts of problems with people sliding down and getting stuck in weird crevices and stuff like that. And not only that, but then we went back to Yellowstone in August, and I looked at those cliffs again, I was like, it doesn't even look like them. So came back and decided to take another crack at this. So here we go. So the first thing to do is to remove all these cliff models, all these meshes, and then we get down to the basic terrain, which obviously looks pretty bad because a lot of it was obscured by those models. And one thing I noticed looking at the real thing is how angular it is. There are some deep gullies, but there's also a lot of steep, flat slabs of rock. So to start over, so here's a nice carving tool where we can basically just say we want to kind of neutralize all that specific stuff and make just a big angled slab. So there we go. So one of the tools I can use is this terracing erosion tool. Obviously this looks quite artificial unless you're making an amphitheater, but you can use it, adjust it to use it to make these little outcrops. And these cliffs have a lot of these outcrops where the rock was just a little tougher than the surrounding rock and didn't get eroded away. So again, that looks very artificial, but that's just the beginning here. Now we can switch to this cool hydraulic erosion tool, which simulates water flow and erosion. So look at this. You can actually see the water flowing down and carries material away. And so because I built up these outcrops, it works around those and it erodes those a bit, but it really favors obviously the paths of less resistance. And so you just do this repeatedly until you've got some nice gullies. Now, sometimes this tool gets a little carried away. You get some extremely steep and narrow gullies, and that needs some softening up to even out those extremes. And then, whoa, boy, you know, you don't want to get nature out of balance. One wrong setting. Eeh. Okay, so now I'm going to try using that terracing tool to add more of these little wrinkles in the terrain, which are pretty obvious when you look at the photographs, but they're tricky to get them to look good here. So again, these are kind of artificial looking, so I'm going to add these and then kind of blend them in more. Still not real happy with how that looks. Okay, we're jumping ahead. I did some experimentation, and well, first of all, I've put in some of those models back, because there are these distinctive outcrops of rocks that we really have to have. But I'm trying to do most of it in the actual terrain, because you get a more natural and continuous surface. You don't get those issues with the intersection points of the different models that we've been having. So I'm using another technique called stamps. So I make a little 2D texture that shows, it's basically a small height map where the grayscale gradient shows from low to high elevation. And then I click and click and click and click and stamp around on the terrain to basically imprint that pattern on it. And so I've got a number of stamps for little erosion patterns of kind of water flowing down and making little tiny gullies and flowing together. I've got some for these little kind of bumps that are really common up there on the cliffs, and basically just adding a lot of detailing to the terrain. And then a lot of smoothing to blend all these features in so they seem like natural features. It took quite a while, a lot of trial and error and experimentation to figure out the best techniques to get the shape of the cliffs that I wanted. So when I moved on to the section of cliffs to the east, they are the one I'm working on, it went much faster, though not quite this fast. Then after all the carving, it's time to repaint the textures, wanting to have different textures depending on the slope. So the flatter areas are more gravelly and the steeper areas are more rocky outcrops. And so here we are after a couple of days of work, running around in the new cliffs. I think it's an improvement. Not only all along here, but also did some work down at the bottom. You know, there's a lot of stuff gets washed down there, and it ought to be down there when you go down there. So here we have a lot of boulders and logs and just debris. So it kind of makes a neat little environment to explore down here as well. And now, as a reward for sitting through yet another video about working on the terrain, here's another little thing that I just added based on our hike up Amethyst Creek in Yellowstone National Park. So we came across this little waterfall, which actually is called Fairies Fall. We found it on a list of waterfalls in Yellowstone. It's one of the smaller ones, only 10 meters, 30 feet tall, but just a beautiful little spot. So we made that in the game. So it's deep in stranger territory, so you may not have much time to enjoy it, but it is, I think, a lovely little spot.